Welcome to Sikhcast, brought to you by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.
In this episode of the Sikhcast, we share a live recording from a live webinar held on November 8th, 2025. Drawing on translations and insights from the Guru Granth Sahib Project, along with Sikh history and tradition, we explore how Gurmat reshape our understanding of death and, in turn, how we live.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you all for joining us today. I am Simran Kaur, the Community Liaison here at the Sikh Research Institute, and I will be moderating today's event as well as the Q&A. During this webinar, we hope to create an intimate Sangat experience during this hour or so we are together. We will begin with a 60-minute discussion, followed by a roughly 30-minute Q&A. I would like to take a moment to introduce our presenters very quickly. We have Jasleen Kaur here with us. She is our research associate, and she has received a Religious Studies BA and MA from the University of Virginia. She is one of the commentators and trans creators of the Guru Granth Sahib Project, and she is passionate about projects that create comfortable spaces for community members of all ages and backgrounds. We also have here with us Surinder Pal Singh, who is a senior research associate. He holds a master's degree in religious studies and in English. He is the English content reviewer for the Guru Granth Sahib Project. He also develops curriculums, presentations, research papers, and delivers courses online for us. We also have Santbir Singh. He is a researcher and educator of Sikh philosophy, history, and visual culture. He serves as a research associate for us and as an associate curator of Sikh art culture at the Royal Ontario Museum, where he is helping design the new Gallery of Sikh Art and Culture. He is currently pursuing a PhD in sociology at York University, where his research focuses on Sikh activism. He was born in Vancouver and lives in Toronto with his wife and 3 children. I will now pass on to our 3 presenters for the 60-minute discussion on our topic today.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's going to be an interesting one. I think even in sort of discussing the topic beforehand, I think there's a lot of things that we'd like to cover. So forgive us if we don't cover everything. And there's certain things that we have discussed. We've done podcasts on shahadat and death before, so we'll direct you to those maybe at the end. But I'm Jasleen Kaur. I wanted to just introduce sort of the thinking behind doing this session and also kick off our discussion. So I think death is a thing that we maybe don't talk about that often outside of kind of the context of either like pretty stark imagery in Bani or like very prescriptive understandings of how we ought to be dealing with death and grief in our sort of lived experiences. So we wanted to complicate that a bit in a good way and in a maybe compassionate way, by exploring a Gurmat perspective on death. So that's looking at death through the lenses of Bani, Tawarik, and Ret. So Bani is what we will dive into first, and then we'll talk about Sikh history, how we see the Gurus dealing with death as like kind of an ideal for us. And then the ending part of the discussion will be about Ret, so lifestyle. And that's where we can kind of, I think, beautifully segue into Q&A and discussion around application, because I think principally maybe we have an understanding, but living that out in our lives is quite difficult. Before we dive into all that, though, I thought maybe we could start by talking a bit about our personal relationships with death and also about maybe what we've observed in popular understandings around death and grief and processing. And then we can get into to the discussion from there. The other thing is we opted not to do slides for this discussion. A lot of the Bani that we'll be referencing is on the Guru Granth Sahib Project website, so you can follow along that way. We wanted this to be a little bit more conversational, and feel a little bit more natural. So with that, I guess we can start with just a very, very brief discussion on how we've come to understand death in our personal contexts. I'll go first quickly, and then Sadhbir Singh will jump in, and Surinder Singh will end that reflection. But for me, my sort of relationship with death and grief in my life was it started when I was quite young. My nanny died when I was 12, and then the deaths that came after that, it was very sudden and sort of shocking because she was quite young. And the deaths that I experienced after that were all sort of violent and shocking and involve people dying what we might say is, like, before their time. Um, and so in my sort of growing through that, I had a long period of not knowing how to metabolize death and grief because I was so young, and also, I think through that, as a family, we really came to understand, um, death as a constant and also as something that you have to kind of, um work through collectively and not be so afraid of. And so I do think that that was very sort of transformative for me growing up, and I think it's made me a little bit more, hesitant to kind of be prescriptive in how I understand other people's grief and death. So I find that to be a kind of, a gift from all of that, early experience with death. Um, yeah, that's all I'll say for now. We can get more into it in the depth, discussion. But Santhveer Singh, if you could jump in and
Yeah,
yeah,
for
tell
sure.
us your yeah.
So my own personal understanding of death, I think, is very similar to a lot of folks. I've lost family members, grandparents, and so on. Um, uh, and what I've always seen with death is there's a narrative that we are told how we should behave um, within a Sikh culture, and then there's a way that people actually behave. Interestingly, I'm married into a family that runs a funeral home, and this funeral home mainly serves Sikh and Punjabi families. And so I get to witness death a lot in that context. And in that context, I think what's been interesting for me to see is how much, um, especially for younger generations, there's confusion around how to talk about death from a Sikhi angle, that there's a lack of understanding of a Gurmat perspective. There's a mimicking of sorts of what people see in popular culture or in other religious traditions. And that then sort of seeps into Sikh understandings, contrary to Gurmat principles. So I think what I'd really like for us to try to get to do today is to take those lofty goals of what Gurmat is asking of us and try to bring it into a lived reality of how do we make that applicable to our lives. And we're going to try to do that using our different examples that we'll have. I just want to end off before I pass it on to Srindapal Singh with a Shabad that really speaks to me about death. And that Shabad is Baba bolte kahage dehi ke sang rehte Surt mae jo nirte kehte karte katha barta kehte. The Shabad by Bhagat Kabir Ji is in the Guru Granth Sahib Project under the funeral section, under the funeral Shabad section. So you can find that Shabad there. And it's just very evocative. Bhagat Kabirji is just saying this Shabad, like this being that existed, that was there, is all of a sudden empty. This being that talked and that behaved. And I think all of us who have been close to death in our lives, that's a really shocking thing that can be very shocking, that this person that you were with, that was animated and that spoke and that you could touch and interact with, is gone and they're just a husk left now. And that can be a very shocking emotional experience that can be quite difficult to process. I'll pass it on to Surinder Singh.
Thank you, Jasleen and Sanbir Singh. I'll pick from where Sanpir left, this idea of shock. And I personally believe, death is either very personal and something very authentic, or it can just be a concept, if you haven't really felt or seen it from, close quarters. I hadn't really seen death until I was about 25, 26, since my father was in Air Force. So we used to live quite far towards the south, most of the time away from Punjab. So I hadn't actually seen any death of close relatives until I was 26. And the first death that I actually saw from close quarters was my own father's. So, it really hit me hard. Two major things that I really, that took me over were the idea of irreversibility,
Mm.
that the dad is gone. He's not going to come back. And the other was the suddenness of it, because I had never experienced anything like that before. And because of that, I hadn't really thought about it much. I had never given it a thought. So that's what I mean by the idea, seeing death as a concept versus something which is very personal, and that makes you think about your life and yourself and makes it more authentic. One moment it's normal, and the next moment everything is gone. It's all changed. It reminds me of Baba Friji's line. It says, Frida and Daryave kanne bagla betha keel karende hanjnu achinte ਬਾਜ ਪਏ ਤਿਸ ਰੱਬ ਦੇ ਕੇਲਾਂ ਵਿਸਰੀਆਂ ਜੋ ਮਨ ਚਿਤਨਾ ਚਿਤੇ ਸਨ so gali rab kiyan. The crane sitting along the banks of the river was frolicking, and all of a sudden the death came as a hawk, as an eagle, and then pounced upon life, and it came all of a sudden, and it's like the divine thing, which just came all of a sudden with no previous awareness of it. So that actually comes like that. And I often think of my own self, when I go to bed, would I actually get up in the morning? Seriously. And that really helps me ground and, in a way, look at life very differently. It gives me a sense of urgency as well. Going to the touching a little bit on the idea of what's the popular understanding I see that within the Punjabi culture, actually the culture I come from, there are certain things that Punjabi culture has imbibed from Sikh perspectives. For instance, when you hear about someone's death, you'll see people use words like akal chalana kar gaya, pura ho gaya, hai na? Te chadai kar gaya, all these words which are received in chardi kala. But still you see so many different ideas and things that people practice that shows that typically we are in ways so much reliant on certain rituals and doing things in a certain way to get above or get over the sense of loss and grief, where we think by doing certain rituals we can probably fix things that we did in the past and then maybe better the future of the person who is deceased. So and you actually see very visible examples of that would be very very show very very show grief so formally is siapa, where people women will actually sit and then beat their chest to show that they are actually grieved by the death. So there's actually a mix and match of different cultures and understandings, where sometimes we actually become our very authentic self and sometimes we lose it in the noise of the popular culture. So something that we really need to explore and think about here, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. I think that really nicely sort of kicks us off into our discussion around Bonnie. So when we were talking, the three of us were talking about this this weekend. I think there were a few themes that we picked out from Bonnie around death. So I thought maybe we could go through some examples of how we see Bonnie sort of invoking death for various, I guess, for various purposes. And so we had talked, the three of us, about Bonnie as pointing out this kind of fear of death or the terror of death, which I think is a big part of our sort of popular understanding, regardless of, religiosity or school of thought. We also talked about death as a reminder of our temporariness, which was touched on already. Um, and death, like the reminder of death as a way to urge us into remembrance of Ikonkar. And then there's the more kind of metaphysical questions that we might have around like what death actually is and what happens after we die. And maybe that can be sort of the second part of this conversation. Um, so I wanted us to first talk about that use of Barney or that use of death as a kind of, if I can say this, like a literary device or something, like within Barney as a thing that is invoked for a purpose other than actually talking about death, which I think is a really interesting thing. Um, and I wanted to touch a bit on Sulok Melanoma, which I know I've done in the past, so I won't do too much dwelling on this, but if you want to see some of that, there is a there is a webinar somewhere out there where we just talk about Sulok Melanoma, but, this was actually my first interaction with, the Bani in a kind of new light. So this was, like, a few years ago. Um, and I think a big learning for me was understanding that actually, like, death in this Bani, like, death is actually not the point. The point is what we do while we're here, and I think this maybe also points to a larger theme in sort of, like, human existence and sort of the curiosities that we tend towards of, like, um, what will happen to us after we die. We, like, fixate on this so much. There's entire kind of, um yeah, cosmologies or to use a word Zanthir used earlier this week, like eschatologies of like different levels of heaven and different levels of hell and different beings. And it's really powerful to me that the gurus sometimes invoke those things as a way to like speak to people who already prescribe to those understandings. But then there's like a transcendence um, of that context for a larger message about the urgency of spending this time here quite wisely. Like, I think that that's a huge thing that really struck me when we worked on this Bonnie a few years ago. Um, and so, the lines that I'm thinking of and you'll have to bear with me, everyone, because my pronunciation is not great, but, the very first stanza of Sulok Melanoma, uh, Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib says, "Gun Gobind gayo nahi, janam akarat keen, kaho nanak har pajmana, jai pid jal ko mean." You have not sung the virtues of the earth nor of Gobind. You've wasted this human life in vain. And then Nanak's signature, Nanak's statement, "O mind, sing praises of the one light of Hud with love, the way a fish yearns for water." So the thing that like strikes me about this is that death itself is not actually explicitly mentioned in this salok, but it's this idea of like wasting our time that really strikes me. Um, and this like the sort of visuals of old age conquering the body come just a few stanzas later. But I think there's this thing that Sundarbal actually pointed to in the sort of intro of like when we experience loss, it becomes a sort of reminder or maybe the first reminder where we're like, oh, actually, one death can come for us at any time. And actually, there is no guarantee that like when I go to bed tonight, I'll wake up tomorrow. So if that is the case, um, how am I spending my time here? So I think that's a huge theme, and when I think about the ways that that has sort of articulated itself in my life as I've experienced different deaths, I feel and this may be a crazy thing to say, but I do feel that I have to learn every single time how to, like, metabolize grief and death in a new way, and also how to learn a real lesson from it that such that it, like, actually affects my thinking and my behavior. I think it's, like, a new lesson every time. I don't know how else to say that. Um, but I'd be curious what you all think about this, and if you wanna talk more about this particular theme, that's great. If you wanna talk about a different theme around death, that's totally fine. We're just having a chat. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple points before passing on to Surinder Singh, who I think can delve a little bit deeper into Sambani. That idea that Surinder Singh said that uh, we don't know if we're going to wake up in the morning. I remember hearing a katha about Bhagat Kabir ji, and he was asked for advice about how to live a life that is like dedicated to Guru, dedicated to Akal Purkh. And Bhagat Kabir ji essentially said, the feeling that you have when you leave a good friend's funeral, that's a feeling you should have all the time. And when you leave a good friend's funeral, you feel like, oh my God, I'm so thankful for being alive. I'm so thankful for this time. I wish I had made more of my time with them. I wish you have a sense of purpose, you have a sense of direction, you want to make the most of your life. And there's that feeling that um and this concept comes up in other traditions as well, that whole memento mori idea, which also comes up in Christianity. This idea that remember death, don't be afraid of it. Remember that it's going to be there, it's going to happen. It's a inevitability. And instead of being afraid of it, build a relationship with it in the way that Justine was talking about, learning from it. And that, of course, is a very scary thing. And especially in a culture that's so seeped as ours is in trying to avoid old age and death, and is so obsessed with youthfulness and staying relevant and young. I think that it can be very difficult to try to build that relationship with death and to build that type of interaction where we use it as a way to live life more fully, ironically. Because when you accept that death is an inevitability, then life takes on a lot more meaning. And I think that's one of those things that Guru Sahib Ji might be trying to say in Bani is make the most of this life because you never know when it's going to end.
Mm.
Surinder Singh, Handy.
And that's actually a very beautiful idea. So I just took two things. One is this idea of abundance, and the other thing, when we know that death is certain, how do we look at life? What kind of a perspective do we really develop to look at life, both life and death? And I find that idea very powerful because I think death gives you a certain sense of both urgency and direction and purpose in life. Because if you have something endless, something, if you have abundance of time and life and money, you wouldn't really care much about it. That's one thing that I get out of it. So I think death is in a way a reminder of our finiteness, and also it helps us ground us and really think about who we are, what is our purpose of life, those kind of very fundamental questions that may tend to change our trajectory, the way we look at things and life. So I think that is very important. So interestingly, yesterday, I was looking up the internet to see what does the word of philosophy say about death. And I was looking clinically or biologically, death is essentially the stopping of the vital functions of the body, like respiration or heart or brain. But what does the word of philosophy say about it? So I found a quote from by Epicurus. It's not a quote, actually. This is what he said, that he argued that when we exist, death doesn't exist, and so we shouldn't really care about it, or it is nothing to us, because when death exists, we do not. So we don't exist at the same time. And I found that idea very interesting, and I was trying to see how does that idea speak to me. And I remember a few lines from Gurbani that speak to me in a slightly different way. So he is looking at death in a very different way. But Gurbani reminds me that, it says, when I am there, death is not. But what Gurbani says is, that's true, but in a different way. When I exist, when my ego exists, when I see myself as alive and wanting to extend my life beyond for eternity, that's death itself. And that reminds me of the line, Jab hum hote tab tu nahi. When I was there, when my ego was there, you didn't exist, or beloved. When you came into my very being, my consciousness, and I realized that it's just you, I am nothing, I became eternal because I lived in you. I merged with you. And I find that idea very beautiful, And, uh, taking that further, you actually might see this line appears in nickname. It says, "Akha jiva visre mar jao." It gives you a very different perspective of life, and that says, when I'm speaking your praises, when I'm really consciously dwelling on your presence, your virtues, that is when I'm alive. Once I forget, when I'm living in forgetfulness, that is essentially that to me. There's actually another one by Baba Friji. Since we did Baba Friji a few months ago, it's just always on my mind. It says, Frida, pichal raat na jagyo hai, jeevan dado moyo. Oh, Frida, you didn't wake up the previous night. This idea of Amrit Vela that comes in the Sikh tradition. So it's another word for Amrit Vela is Pichal Rat, which is essentially when 1/4 of the previous night is still remaining, which is like 3 hours before the sunrise. The idea is when the entire world was sleeping, they weren't really conscious of anything. Did you bring your own death or your living into your reflection and consciousness and think about it and then connect with the divine, the ultimate reality? And if you didn't do that, then you're as good as dead. There's no point of so it's a very different way of looking at death. So the Gurmat perspective is the two ways to die: physically, and the other one is we could, quote unquote, spiritually. And what Gurmat is more focused on is trying to understand how I can make myself alive and live in myself in terms of my awareness of my existence. And I find that idea very beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. There's this power there that Guru Sahib Ji is giving us, and that ek karina milte ta kal jog hota. That like when I'm not connected to you, that's death. That's the end of the world. That's everything that's terrible. And so it's flipping the idea of death on its head, because real death, the physical death, is not what you fear. It's this death of falling out of love, or not being in love, or not being connected, or being disconnected. And that's what really strikes at your heart. Um, that is really powerful and amazing. But and I see this question coming up in the chat as well. People ask, how do you deal with it when family members pass away? How do you bring that understanding of Gurmat into your life? And I think that's an interesting place for us to take it next.
Yeah. I mean, so I think this sort of goes into this question of how Bonnie talks about the more metaphysical, like, understanding of death as maybe not what we think it is. And so um, there's a Shabad that's on the Guru Granth Sahib Project website in the funeral ceremonies by Guru Arjan Sahib in Ramkali. And it's Pavan mein pavan samaya, Jyoti mein jyot ral jaya, Mati mati hoye ek, Rovan hare ki kavan tek. So it's it's like first describing this like physical thing that's happening, right? So the air is merging with the air, the light is blending with the light, the soil is blending with the soil. So it's like this kind of, I think, beautiful sort of elemental description of what happens when we die. That I think when we were talking about it, it really goes into that kind of it aligns with that kind of that scientific idea of like the law of thermodynamics, that nothing actually is created or destroyed, that things just go back into their elements. And the last line is of that first stanza is, what is the support of the one who weeps? And the Rahal line is Kaun mua re kaun mua, Brahm Gyani mil karo bichara, eto chalat paya Rahal. So I love this. I like come to this all the time because it's helped me so much through like grieving of like this question that is so it's a little bit, I find it like a little bit tongue in cheek. I'm sure it's open to interpretation, but this thing of like who's actually died and what is actually happening here? There's like a kind of pause that's being asked of us, literally in the Rahal line, to actually reflect on like what's happening here. And if we can become sort of reflective, maybe we can see this process as a kind of play, which is like such a radical idea. It's so hard to put into practice. But this thing um, of death as not just a reminder, but also as, like, the actual, um, death as, like, an occurrence, as part of the play and part of the command, which I think we'll talk about a little bit in when we get to a discussion around, like, Ramkali Sat. But this idea that, like, even the things that we think we understand about this, like, thing we all must go through, whether through, like, experiencing it when other people leave this world or when we leave, even that has a kind of beautiful mystery around it that does not get resolved in Bani. And I think you can either take that as frustrating or you can take that as, "Oh, like, maybe actually I can reframe the way that I understand death and grief," and maybe not immediately after, because I saw a comment in the chat about, like, sort of expecting people to just be alright right after a huge death happens. I don't think that that's what Bonnie's asking us to do. Like, when I look at this Shabad, I think that there's a gentle urging towards a reframing that maybe comes years later of, like, maybe I can understand this too as something beautiful. Um And later, I mean, the sort of the end of the Shabad is that everybody has to go through this. Even the person crying will eventually have to get up and go. Um, and our crying is sort of a result of the illusions that we have around our relationships, which I wanna talk a bit more about and hear from both of you about too, because I think in my experience, I can kind of relate to the people in the chat of, like, an impatience that I've seen with people who are grieving to resolve their grief neatly according to, like, the ideal that Bonnie presents to us, and sort of a lack of, like, compassion or empathizing. And also, I think, like, taking to the extreme the message that Bonnie gives us, which is like, yes, our relationships are temporary and tied to temporariness, but also that can shift. Uh, so I think that there's plenty of guidance in Bonnie about actually making our relationships with the people we love much more vast than they are, much more vast than being tied to circumstance and to the body. And so actually, the way that I've understood that then is that death and grief provide actually, like, beautiful outlets towards remembrance, not just of the one who's left, but also of the one to whom they have gone, if I can say that. And then also beautiful beautiful opportunities to be in gratitude, which goes back to the thing that we were talking about before of, like, how can we reframe our maybe, like, frustration with thinking someone has gone too soon or anger around death into something that looks more like an eventual difficult arrival at acceptance of hukam and also a deep gratitude for the time we had with people. Um Yeah, I'd be curious to hear both of your thoughts on that. Um,
Yeah, I think that idea that people are expected to get better quickly or people are expected to be, I think it's a very um sort of um cold way of looking at loving relationships between individuals. And I think there's a much more beautiful and vast way of looking at those relationships. And I had mentioned this earlier when we were talking that the Sakhi of Guru Gobind Singh Sahib Ji and coming across the body of Baba Ajit Singh as he left Jamkor Sahib really speaks to me. And when he came across the body of Baba Ajit Singh, Daya Singh said, we should cover Babaji's body up. And Guru Sahib Ji's response was, if you can cover up his body, I'll let you cover it up as long as you have enough kapra here to cover up the body of all my children who have died here.
Mm.
And so it's not that Guru Gobind Singh Ji doesn't love his children, his biological children. It's that he loved all his children equally. And so, in the same way, it's not that we are supposed to not be in love with our family. It's that we're supposed to be in love with all people as much as we love our family. And that's a really, I think, much more beautiful way of looking at it. So the problem is not connection. The problem is maybe a lack of connection with the rest of the universe instead of overly connected to some people and thinking of it in those negative terms. Thinking of it more as a positive, how can I love more? How can I connect with more beings? How can I connect with others? How can I see the divine light within all beings and understand that there's something greater than um, this physical reality that I'm interacting with? Surrender Pulsing?
Yeah, thank you, Sindhwar, for sharing that. I think that's a beautiful idea. I think if I rephrase it, what essentially Gurmat or Gurbani tells us is to actually enlarge our, you know, widen our vision and perspective, and bringing and thinking of the entire creation as our family. When you actually do that, it just changes the entire thing. Everyone becomes your family. When that happens, this duality goes away. Once the duality goes away, everything in life changes, the perspective, everything else, and gives you a very different way of looking at things, which you showed through the example of the Sampasha. I actually want to dwell a little bit more on the Shabad that Jasleen shared, and thank you for bringing up that Shabad, Jasleen. Kaun hua re, kaun hua, the Rahul line simply asks, people are crying death, somebody has died. And the Guru asks this very fundamental question about, okay, tell me, who has really died? Let's get together and connect with the wise ones who understand this and reflect on this and really see what has happened. Even though within that Rahau line, Guru also gives the pointer, in a way, gives the answer that it's essentially, it's a wondrous play that the divine has started. You know, the actual lines that give me assurance that, if it helps anyone else, is in the third and the fourth stanza. The first and the second stanzas are very clinical in nature, where Guru tells it. They sound very scientific to me in a way. It sounds funny, but yeah, Pavanam and Pavan Sumaya, the air, merged with air, light blended with the light, and the soil with the soil. But the real thing is, which if it gives you any solace, is ये तो चलत रचिया करतार. This is essentially a play created by the creator. Avat javat hukam avar. The person comes and goes. The Guru doesn't use word dies. He says the person just arrives on the scene, the theater, and then just leaves it. It's a very different perspective of looking at it. And then Guru says, Na nah ko mua, na marna jog. No one really either dies or is capable of even dying. The Guru says, you're not even capable of dying. See the word choice Guru is making here. Nobody is even capable of dying. Nobody really dies. Nah binsa abnasi ho. The real life force is actually beyond destruction. So nobody really dies. And then in the last stanza, the Guru, further takes this thought and says, Jo eh jano, so eh nai. What you think of it, it is not actually. This entire phenomena that you're seeing around you, it's probably you don't have that far-sighted vision. That's why you're seeing something which it is not. So what you see, it is not that. It is something else. The individual that you thought has died hasn't really died. It's essentially the elements merging with the elements. The person has actually not died. Probably my understanding of that person was very myopic or short-sighted. We think of people. For instance, I always say this. I might think of Santbir as this form with these glasses and the mala, but essentially, if I go back to the line that Santbir started with, Baba, bolte te kahan gaye? Oh wise, tell me, where did that being go? And when the Guru says that, essentially Guru is saying we are essentially a consciousness. We're not the form that we are seeing it. And that consciousness, that life force never dies. It's essentially the visible form that just merges with the nature, and we think the person has died. And that idea really gives me a lot of, comfort and support, that I probably need to connect with the Shabad more deeply and then understand and develop this perspective. And says, Janan hare ko bal jao, kaho nanak gur param chukaya. Guru Nanak states that the Guru has, removed this illusion that I had, and says, Na koi mara, na aave jaya. Nobody really dies, or neither comes or goes. So that idea I find really very powerful. That essentially we are consciousness, the life force, not the physical, the soil that we see, which takes different forms. So that is very powerful to me. Yeah.
Just should we move on to a short discussion about Ramkali Sad? I think I'm looking at the time, and
Yeah. Yeah. I think that works because that sort of functions as a historical example. I think maybe we can talk about I saw something in the chat. I'm trying not to look too much at the chat, but I saw something in the chat about sort of the guru's examples of how serving as examples of how to deal with death.
yes.
Um
So
and yeah, go ahead.
no, sorry, I was just gonna say I'll just set it up and I'll let you two discuss it. But since you have more experience with the Bani, Ramkali Sad was the Bani revealed by Guru Amar Das Sahib Ji's great grandchild, Baba Sundar. And it's Baba Sundar talking about what happened when Guru Amar Das Sahib Ji's Jyoti Jyot happened. And for those of you who don't know, Jyoti Jyot is a term we use when we talk about the Gurus leaving their physical bodies, because we don't use the term death when speaking about the Guru, because of course the light of the Guru continues from one Jyot to another. And so the Shabad is a really instructive one. It has a lot of history in it and a lot of lit in it as well, a lot of how to live our life. This Bani of Baba Sundar's, which I believe is made up of 640s. And in this Bani, Baba Sundar describes what Guru Amar Das Sahib Ji is giving as advice to his loved ones before his Jyoti Jyot, before Guru Sahib Ji leaves this world, and what he is telling people. And I think that is, for those who don't know, Ramkali Sad is read at funerals. After the funeral is done, when we go back to the Gurdwara Sahib, and you do the Path Bhog, usually if there's an Akhand Path or a Sage Path, then you read Ramkali Sad along with other Banis like Galania. And so this is a Sikh tradition to read this, most likely from the time of Guru Arjan Sahib Ji onwards, to read this Bani at a time of loss. And so there's a lot to learn from it. I'll pass it on to you too. Surinder Palsik?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for sharing this. So essentially, we are delving into the history part of how the Sikh tradition sees death. And I think Sad is a very good example of that. And it's essentially a description of, as narrated by, documented by Baba Sundarji, the death of Guru Amar Das Sahib. And so I'll just invoke 3 stanzas out of those 6. One is the very first one, and then the 4th and the 5th one. In the first one, Baba Sundarji shares what is the state of mind of Guru Amar Das Sahib when he is ready to leave the earthly realm. And it says, Gur Shabad Samave, Avar na jane koi jiyo. Remember I was talking about this idea of how, once if we remove our dualities and we start seeing oneness, everything changes, our perspective about life, and both life and death. And Baba Sundarji says, Guru Amar Das Sahib, the master, the sovereign, is already in that state, is merged in the Shabad, and don't see any duality in life. And by virtue of that, as an extension, I would say, this is my understanding, the Guru doesn't really see much of a difference in this, perishing of worldly, bodily form. And then, so it's essentially a continuation. Gur Shabad Samave, Avar na jane koi jiyo, Avar na jane Shabad Guru ke. Other than the wisdom of the Guru doesn't really rely on anything else in the world as a support. Ek naam te aave, and Guru is always essentially connected with the one naam. Prasad Nanak Guru Angad Param Padvi Pav. And because of the grace of the house of Guru Nanak and Guru Angad and the Shabad bestowed by them, Guru Amar Das is already merged with the divine and is eternal, is beyond death, birth and death. That's my interpretation of it. And there is only a transition in happening. And Guru is already in that state of, equipoise and steadiness. And I find that idea very, beautiful. Aya Hakara, Chalan Wala, Har Ram, Naam Samaya, Jag Amar Atal Utol Thakur, Pagat Te Har Paya, Pagti Te Har Paya. That idea that, when the messenger or death actually came, it didn't really change anything for the Guru, because Guru is already merged with the divine. And in the fourth and the fifth stanza, Guru actually gives us guidance on how to tackle death in your very personal space. And it says, Satguru Pane Apne. It's very instructional and narrative in nature. It tells, what the Guru did when death approached, physical death approached. And it says, Sadguru Pane Apne Beh Parvar Sadaya, in accordance with his own will, Guru, summoned everyone to come together, the entire family. Mat ko pichha koi rov si, so main mool na paya. I wouldn't like it at all if someone cries after me, for me. So that tells me that you haven't really understood the message. You haven't really seen the reality, the perspective. That's my interpretation of it. Please don't cry, because you cry only at a loss. There is no essentially any loss here. Something to think about. Mitapaja, and then Guru interprets what's happening. Guru says, I am being enrobed, honored by the divine, called by the divine to be enrobed, in the court, in the divine court, and says, if your friend, your beloved is being honored, would you not feel pleased or be happy about it? Mitapaja, Midbiksa. If the friend is honored, the other friend will really feel happy about it if they are genuinely friends. eh? Just myth ki paj pawe, who is really happy with, seeing their friend grow and being honored. So be pleased that your guru is being honored by the divine. Tusi vichar dekho put pai, har sadguru pehnave. Think about it, deeply reflect on it. It's the divine who's honoring the guru. So it's a very different way of looking at that. And in the fifth stanza, Guru says, Ante Sadguru Bolya. Then it gives a very clear instructional understanding of what a Sikh ought to do. It says, at the end, the Guru spoke and said, do this. मैं पीछे कीर्तन करे हो निर्वाण जियो. After my physically, when I move away from here, do kirtan. Join in singing praises of the divine. And that is the ultimate tool I think that Sikhs have. Because most of the times when we are dealing with that, we think of, responses in very formulaic sense. What should I do? How should most of the questions, if you see, are what can I do? How can I really deal with the death of a loved one? Guru says you can't do anything. It's a very formulaic way of looking at things. Unless you merge with the Shabad, you are in eternal bliss of singing praises. Everything is formulaic. When I'm living that Shabad, when I'm in eternal bliss of, singing virtues, my response will be automatically. I wouldn't really have to. There's no crisis in life. What now? And that Shabad through me, manifests, and I start to see that, larger picture that, Guru is showing us. It says, Keso Gopal Pandit Sadhyo, bring all the virtuous people of the divine, the lovers of the divine, and sit and do Katha and Kirtan of the divine. And that is how you get over the false sense of loss or departure, which is actually not happening. It's just things changing form, or the journey moving on, continue. And so I find that idea, very powerful. Yeah. Jasleen, you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I do. I think I'm always like struck by this Bani, because I think it offers us, I mean, I know it offers us an ideal of how we ought to deal with death, and I think there's also deep like understanding and compassion for the ways that we maybe can't get there right now. And so I think for me, there's like a couple of things that I really like think about when I think about um this Shabad. There's this like framing of accepting death as being like a way for us to participate in hukam, which is like a very interesting reframing, I think, of like instead of it just being an acceptance of hukam, Guru Amardas Sahib is seeing his own departure as like it's like a collab. I can't say that. A collaboration between him and the divine of like, yeah, this is my time. I've been called and I'm accepting this because I get to take part in this like beautiful thing. And then you have this language of like honoring and being enrobed in honor um because he's able to like take part in that like the fulfillment of that play and of that will, which I think is so beautiful. And so I think it's instructive both on the part of like what ought we do when we are finally at this point? How do we then process our own departure? I think I think that where it gets like a little bit harder is how do we process death when it's not actually directly happening to us? Which is like, I mean, the chat I think is mostly questions around that. And I remember when we were working on this, Bonnie, that line of like, I won't like it at all if you cry after me. I remember a lot of discussion about like how do we how do we say this without it sounding like harsh or um lacking in understanding or compassion, because I remember the Punjabi team saying like actually it's very soft. It's like a very beautiful line. Um and it's the way that you said it, Sunderbal, of like please don't cry. Like please don't, I don't want you to feel this way because I'm seeing it this way. So if you can kind of get to where I am of how you're understanding my departure, then like maybe you can see this as a kind of celebratory thing and as a beautiful thing. But there is a kind of implicit acknowledgement, I think, in these stanzas of how hard that is when we aren't the guru, when we aren't like so enlightened and so steeped in Shabad that like that is our that's our response without having to work for it or work through it. Um, so I think that like I really come back to this as um a kind of gentle, I'll say gentle like 50 more times I think in this conversation, but a gentle like urging towards a larger perspective, a vaster perspective. And I think that the thing that we maybe get wrong when we actually do more harm than good when we're like trying to comfort people who are going through death, either as like a witness or as the person who is leaving, is that we want this kind of ideal to be reached immediately, even if we're just pretending that we've reached it, like even if we're just saying it with words. Um, and there have been a couple of comments in the sort of chat about like grief as a process and um having compassion for that journey too. So I think that there's something in Sadhbani that points to that kind of compassion, even as the Guru is saying, please don't cry. I don't want you to cry. I'm actually being honored. I'm taking part in this beautiful completion of this particular play, this particular element of the will. Um, and I think that last stanza that you talked about, Surinder, about like where like literal instruction is given of like turn to Shabad. I think that actually is where we can kind of I don't know, that's where we can kind of root ourselves even if we can't get to the other things. So even if this is really hard and I'm going through the 5 stages of grief and I'm not accepting this right now, maybe we can still turn to the Shabad and hope that that understanding starts to sort of, yeah, become illuminated from within ourselves. I think that is why this Barney really sticks with me, because when we talk about especially the Guru period, it's really easy to be like, well, the Guru's lost all of these family members and went through horrific things. So, like, who are we to have a hard time? Which I actually find to be kind of contradictory to how I would think the Gurus would deal with our flawed human experience and understanding of things that are difficult. So, like, even when I think about, like, the sort of modus operandi of the Gurus at large, if I can even go that far, when I read these shabads that talk about that urge us into reflection, whether they're about death or not, there is a first person thing happening here where there's, like, a first person reflection on the part of, like, a Guru, or in the case of, like, Sheikh Farid, this personal reflection that then gets expanded into an invitation to reflect in the same way. And I think that if we can understand even the shabads that talk about death and give us like very clear guidance as being compassionate and understanding and empathetic um towards the like reality of us being humans who don't have that large perspective, who don't have that large understanding, and who maybe aren't as steeped in Shabad as we'd like to be, then we can also stop being so hard on each other about the ways we see that we're each sort of individually processing death and grief. I think that's much more instructive than just saying, well, the gurus went through all this, so like kind of, buck up, if I can say that. um, yeah. Does anybody else have any thoughts on that?
Yep, that's beautiful. I think, when, Guru says, don't grieve after me, that leaves you with a dilemma. How do that instruction is very clear
Mm,
and very clinical in nature, if I could say that. How do I really do that in my reality of, a limited understanding of life and having this very big idea of loss and grief?
mm,
How do I really deal with that? That also makes me reflect on, and think, does Guru really mean to say that? Because it's essentially emotions that make us humans, crying, happiness, sorrow, all these things. Is the Guru really after making us not cry?
mm,
So that is something that really, uh, strikes, is very striking to me. I
mm,
think Guru isn't really saying that, do this or do not do this technically. What I think Guru is after is transforming our experiences. And that, reminds me of, couple of lines, actually not a couple, many lines in Gurbani where Guru says, transform your grief.
mm,
And if you are really interested in crying, then cry in this yearning for the divine, this sense of separation. Bring that sense of separation in you, and then cry in yearning for the beloved one. So maybe transform your emotions, not really deny them or get rid of them, but really see how you can channel them through the wisdom of the Shabad.
mm,
That is something I find very powerful. Just a couple of days ago, I was really actually sitting in the Sangat, and then this is how nature operates. And there were a couple of Shabads that came, and I was stuck with it because I knew we are going to do this webinar, and I was constantly thinking about this idea of death. And it says, "Sant tumhare har pran Prabhu sukh date." You are the support of life, O giver of happiness, divine Gur Prasad kahun jate. Now that I've found the Guru's wisdom through the Guru's grace, where do I go? I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm really steady and grounded now. Sant tumare tumre pritam. Oh beloved, the saintly beings, the lovers, they are yours and yours only. Tinko kal na khate. Because they are in love, they have actually transformed their grief into something bigger. They have this constant yearning for you. Everything is coming from that perspective now. And since they have merged in you, they have become one with you. And since you are eternal, they don't die.
mm,
Tinko kal na khate. The death doesn't devour them. Sant tumare, tumre pitam. Oh beloved, the saintly beings, the lovers are yours and yours only. And that doesn't devour them. That cannot do anything with them. Because Rang tumare, their experience has transformed.
mm,
It's not that they become robots or formulaic in their approach. Rang tumare, their grief has been transformed or changed into something else. Rang tumare lal paya, you're in deep love, crimson red. They are completely immersed in the love of the now. And that's how they have, in a way, evaded death. And I find this idea, description very beautiful.
And I think that transitions nicely. We wanted to talk about Shahidi just a little bit, just to touch on it. And I think that's what we see with Shaheeds. We have generations of Sikhs that died with the words Akal on their lips, that they would say Akal as they fell in battle. And that idea that they were infinite because they were not subject to death. They were outside of that because of how much they were in love with Akal Purakh. And we had talked about different Sakhis that might be relevant, and Surinder Singh had suggested talking about Baba Gurbakh Singh. And I've written about Baba Gurbakh Singh quite a bit in the past as well for different articles. His experience is really quite powerful. He, along with 33 other Sikhs, stayed behind to defend Harmandir Sahib and Akal Takht from an army of 30,000 Afghani soldiers. And so it was a lost battle in a sense. There was no way they could survive. There was no way they would come out as victors in the physical sense. And the morning of the battle, they dressed themselves as bridegrooms, as grooms. They got ready as if they were going to get married. And they sprinkled saffron on their kesar, on their dastars, which is what you do before weddings traditionally in Punjab in historic times. And they said, we are getting married to death today. That there was this celebratory nature. And we see this even in the modern times with people like Sukhan Jinda, who said, let us kiss our nooses when we die, and let us put the nooses around our own necks when we are executed by the Indian government, because we are not sad about this. We are celebrating this moment. So shaheeds are on this level that Bani talks about, of that sant level of being so in love with the divine that death does not eat them anymore, that they have become infinite, they become eternal, they become something outside of the bounds of time. And those examples can be found, of course, going back all the way to Guru Arjan Sahib Ji. And Guru Arjan Sahib Ji is the ultimate example of Shahidi, of course, for all of us, for all Sikhs, for all time. And Guru Arjan Sahib Ji's words when he was on the Tatita, Vitera Kiya Mitha Lage, that idea that this experience, even the experience of being tortured, is mitha to me. It reminds me always of that line from Japji Sahib, Ketya Duk Puk Sadmar Ebe Datri Datar, that even Puk and Duk are dat, are gifts from you. That if you're in a place of that much love of Akal Purakh and Vaiguru, of Ikwankar, that even experiences that most of us would think of as negative, even those are beautiful gifts because they are an experience that you're experiencing with the divine. And Guru Sahib Ji is in that place where even the experience of being tortured, even that is something that's wondrous to him, something that's ecstatic, something that's beautiful and grand for him, because he is at a place where what happens to his body doesn't matter, because he is so immersed completely in Bani that the distinction between Shabad and Guru has been completely erased, and they are Shabad Guru themselves. Yeah. I'll pass it back to Justine.
Oh, yeah, I thought this was all beautiful. I don't have anything to add. I think it's all yeah, sorry, Srinapal, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that idea is very beautiful because I dwell on that quite a bit. When I think of Guru being tortured to, physical annihilation, how do we really process that idea? And I find that very powerful when Guru says, our tradition holds it, the legend, the Guru says, Tera kiya mitha lage. You're being tortured physically and you're going through a lot of physical pain. And you have right in front of you, from a worldly perspective, an enemy who's doing that to you, inflicting pain on you, right? And then Guru saying that Tera kiya mitha lage. What exactly is that perspective, that or that feeling that makes the Guru says that what you're doing to me is pleasing to me, is sweet to me? Yeah. And I find that idea very powerful. I think Santkir alluded to that and touched on it. I think it's more about how the Guru, having removed that sense of duality from their mind and vision, so they don't see Jahangir or Aurangzeb, or for that matter anyone else, as the other. They have realized that whoever we see as other or enemy is essentially is a tool in the hands of the divine will. So whatever is happening, it's not the Aurangzeb or the Jahangir who's inflicting, torture or pain on my body. It's essentially the divine who, through these people, is actually manifesting or making the divine will manifest parade. So that really changes everything. It says it's essentially you, the beloved, who's doing everything. And I love you so much. How can I be really displeased with that? Because there is no other in Guru's vision. There is no duality, there's no other, and there's no enemy. And that's how, so it's essentially changing your perspective and looking at things and life differently. That is what changes everything. It's the perspective. When the perspective shifts, everything else shifts in life, both our ideas and how we use grief. That is, I think, very powerful. Thank you, Sandeep, for bringing that up.
I think we can move into questions because I think they'll tie really beautifully into what we understand as like the death sort of part of this conversation of like lifestyle and application. So I'll turn it over to Simran and we can jump in.
Thank you so much. I'd like to jump into one question, which has come up a few times in various forms. So I'm just going to sort of summarize it into one short sentence here. So generally speaking, what is the Sikhi concept of life after death?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. And I was, uh, if you come to Siddhik, in Sikhi 101, we explore Asakivad, and there's a slok of Guru Nanak Sahib Ji's where he talks about what happens to a Muslim body after death, because Muslims believe, and as Christians and Jewish people as well, believe that the body's essence stays within the body, and then the time of the Messiah coming, the body will arise from the grave and be in heaven forever with the divine. And so Guru Nanak Sahib Ji is talking about this understanding, this popular understanding of death. And he ends the slok by saying, So jane kartar, that actually the only one who really knows what happens after we die is Kartar, is the Akal Purkh Vaheguru, Ek Oankar. And Vaheguru is not really telling us. And Guru Sahib Ji is not telling us either. Guru Sahib Ji is saying this is something that is unknowable, fundamentally unknowable. And I think that it it would be much easier for a lot of us if Guru Sahib Ji gave a very clear delineation that this is exactly what happens after you die, that you'll go to this place and then this will happen, and then after that you'll experience this if you behaved in this way, and if you behaved in this other way you'll experience this. That would be much easier, and that's what a lot of other religious traditions do. But the gurus were revolutionary in so many ways, and they weren't just revolutionary in political and social spheres, they were revolutionary in spiritual spheres as well. And this revolution in the spiritual sphere was that this doesn't matter in the end. Because any time that a culture becomes overly focused on the afterlife, you'll see historically that is often used as an excuse to keep people subjugated in this world. So, for example, the way that Christianity was used with enslaved African folks in America, that to focus on heaven as a reward for afterlife to make up for your slavery in this life. Or the way that the caste system uses reincarnation as a tool to ensure that the people who are so-called low caste or untouchable caste stay in line, because they are worried that if they don't, then they will not have the opportunity to be born into a higher caste in their next life. And so a culture that obsesses a lot with what happens after we die stops caring so much about what happens while we're alive. And the Gurus had a very different worldview, one which this world matters, and how we treat each other matters here. And so instead of obsessing over what happens after we die, let's focus on what happens now. And that's difficult. That is harder. I won't say that not all of us have thought about it would be really nice to know what happens after we die. But that's the Guru is challenging us in that way.
Yeah, I think uh, one line that comes to my mind, that speaks to that is, Raj na chaho, mukt na chaho, man eet charan kamlare. That, people are really looking after, definitive answers, because the Guru says, you're stuck in this relativity of, looking at life. And out of this perspective of relativity of light, finiteness of things, you get stuck in these fixations, idea that have forms, that have a beginning, and then they have an end. Heaven, hell, life, death. And that, takes you away, removes you from what your immediate focus should be. And it says, and I find this line, which is very oft used, but very instructive in nature, and which gives you very clear frame for at least a lover or Sikh of the Guru. It says, you know, in this world, there are two kind of people. One who are actually looking for divine connection, or at least they claim, and the other ones who are after earthly comforts and dominion, rule, and power. And the Guru says, I'm after none. Neither am I interested in worldly power and comforts and pleasures, nor am I really interested in, what the classical understanding of spirituality and life and death is. My only concern is being in that state of love all the time. That is all I'm really concerned about. I don't really am after this idea of liberation after that, emancipation after that. I want to be free now in your love and being, singing your praises. You know what Guru Amar Das Sahib says, that after me, sing praises, stay in that state of love, and then sing the praises all the time. So I think that is what Sikhi is more focused on, instead of thinking about here and hereafter. The Guru says focus on here, and not just focus on here. Make this here more worthwhile, beautiful, and pleasurable. And pleasurable in the sense of finding that pleasure in the Shabad, not the temporary comforts that come and go.
And this also gives us opportunity to talk about the Rehat Maryada as well. And if we see the Rehat Maryada, really the section on death is interesting. It's very simple. It says, do the funeral. If you can't do a cremation, it's okay to just immerse the body in water if need be. But do a cremation. Don't do any special rituals around it. Do kirtan, do a sage part or a khand part bhog if that's what the family has done at the time of death. And then it just lists off all of these traditional Indic rituals that are done in the Indian tradition, and says, don't do this tradition, don't do this ritual, don't do this ritual, don't do this ritual. And so we can transplant that to our context here in the West as well. Just the Guru Sahib saying, don't fall prey to thinking that you need to do these certain things to help the deceased person go on to the next level or make it through the afterlife, or all these other different traditional beliefs that come from the Indic tradition. Instead, focus on celebrating that moment. And that can be very difficult. I'm not saying that that's easy. And especially, like Jaslina said, when we talk about people who we feel have gone, quote unquote, before their time, which is, of course, is a fallacy, but it's a feeling that's quite powerful. When someone passes away after a long illness at old age, then it's almost a blessing when they pass away, that this person's suffering is over. When someone young passes away or someone dies in a violent way, that is such a shock that to celebrate that moment seems very impossible. But what Guru Sahib Ji is asking of us is, can you, in those moments, be thankful for the life that's been lived instead of focusing on what will happen to this person after they've left us?
Yeah, I won't add too much. I think there's something really interesting about the way that we sort of perpetuate fear around death and the afterlife, and the way that that kind of takes over. Um, and I think that the even when the gurus are invoking kind of stark imagery around death, they're speaking to an already existing sort of popular understanding about what might happen to us. You have imagery of death um, seizing you by the hair, hitting you over the head, breaking your bones. It's really crazy stuff. And I think even in the kind of question about what will happen to us after we go, I know, seeing my grandparents pass away, my dadi was not sort of she kind of had we could call it like a blessing in disguise in that she wasn't fully sort of lucid towards the end, but my dada was kind of almost, if you ask me, too lucid. So we would have all these conversations. He was 92, 93, and I watched him become a little bit, I had said this earlier and somebody was like, "It's actually not this." So I'll correct myself after I say it, but I was like, I kind of feel like sometimes when we're at the verge of leaving this earth, we become a little bit Catholic in how we tally up our deeds and misdeeds, and I was corrected rightfully that, like, it's just classical religion in any sort of way that we're so fixated on, like, what will meet us when we go. Did we do enough? And I think the urging in Bonnie towards, like, here and now is, like, why don't we take that reflection into the present instead of waiting to sort of panic about what consequences we'll face in the end? And this ties into, I think I saw a question around, like, karma, and I would reframe that as maybe a question around grace, because in the Sikh paradigm, yes, there's this idea of, like, karam, of the deeds that we do, and of sort of our fortunes being written on our forehead. That imagery is really prevalent. But there's also very prevalent references to the ways that we create good fortune through the efforts that we make, through the devotion that we engage in, and the sort of struggle that we all go through to practice remembrance and praise and identification with Ikon God. And I think that's a really beautiful thing. It's less sort of certain in what will happen to us when we go, which maybe we can see as more like terrifying in some ways, but I think there's a simplicity to what we're being asked to do that's really beautiful. Um, and it's like an ask to kind of commit to a relationship with the Shabad, with the wisdom, with Nam, with identification, and with Ikon God, um, in all of its kinds of ebbing and flowing and ups and downs, and to really believe in the grace of Ikon God too, to like ask for help. Um, And so I think that maybe can sort of make death lose its sort of terror for us too, if we can really focus on those ideals or ideas that are present in Bonnie, those principles. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much for all your insights on that question. I'm going to move on to another one I noticed in the chat, which is that in the beginning of the session, there was a discussion about the idea of death and death as an experience. So that second state, which is death as an experience, is very painful, especially if it's of a close family member. How can we shift our perspective when we're in that situation itself, which is, maybe a very high emotion, high stress, surrounded by many people? And this question is from Amanpreet Kaur, so thank you for that question.
I think that just to start off the discussion, I think the advice in Ramkali Sad is also very practical. It says to kirtan, and to sit together as a sangat. Uh, a close family friend's father passed away violently a few years ago, and the family's response was just to do kirtan night after night and to do part together as a family. And the atmosphere that was created in the house because of that was incredible. It was really not the feeling of a family that had suffered a great tragedy, because they were all singing kirtan together and immersed in Shabad as much as possible. And I think relying on Bani and building that relationship with Guru Granth Sahib Ji and really seeing Bani as a support is the only thing that we can really do, because we are so uh, um, unattached. We are so disconnected. We are so frail. And we are also open to being in love with things that are not permanent. And the only thing that we can really do in those moments is to turn to Bani and build that relationship with Bani and to lean on Bani for support in those times. And if you can do that as a family or as a community, that becomes so much more powerful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think, when you might have heard of the slok quite often towards the end of a divan, whenever there's Nansa being read, you will hear this quite often. It's by Mela Panjwa, Sikho Shabad Pyareo, Janam Maran Ki Tek, Mukh Ujjal, Sada Sukhi, Nanak, Simrat Ek. It says that, oh beloveds, oh loved ones of the Guru, make wisdom, the Guru Shabad, the support of your life. Learn it, internalize it, imbibe it, and become that. Because this is one thing that I've learned in my life. When my dad passed away, and I now, looking back, thinking about it, I can't even imagine myself. For some reason, I was, much closer to that experience of, you know, for whatever reason, I actually did ardas of my own dad within 2-3 hours of my dad passing away. I was 20, I didn't have much exposure to the Sangat at that time. And I did ardas of my own dad. And I can't really, 30 years later, I can't really even think, 20 years later, I can't even think about how did that even transpire? How did that even happen? Because it isn't something, it was very organic because it probably just came from within me.
Mm.
And if I start looking at it as an action item, I won't actually be able to even do it. Unless Guru says either it's my reality, my inherent, it's my core, or it's not.
Hmm.
So the Guru says, as long as I'm living in this realm, in this space of formulaic approaches, I am not there, and it is not going to help. If I really want to be moved and actually be in that state within, I have to connect with this Shabad. And that is only when I will actually be able to get over this idea of grief and know, actually not know, because knowing is about ideas and information. Be, be, be that response which comes from within me. And that response is of love. And because I am consciously living in that space of love, of connection, of remembrance that, you are my take. Sikho Shabad Pyareo, Janam Maran Ki Tek. Learn that Shabad, internalize that Shabad, make that Shabad the focus of life, because that Shabad is the support of not just life but death. Mukh Ujjal, Sada Sukhi. What does a person really look in life? Comfort and honor. You know, when people have made so much money in life, and then they say, I want the community and people to remember me. So comfort and honor. Guru Sahib says, Mukh Ujjal, you will be honored, you will be respected. Sada Sukhi, and you will always be happy when you are in remembrance of the divine. And so this sloka is, I find very powerful for myself, And one idea which I always think of and continue to, try to internalize and remind myself, that I need to give up this formulaic approach of what if, what do I do when this happens, what do I do when this happens. This is not the approach of a lover. The approach is, how do I, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਜਪਜੀ ਸੰਦਾ ਕਿਵ ਕਰ ਆਖਾ ਕਿਵ ਸਲਾਹੀ ਕਿਉਂ ਵਰਨੀ ਕਿਵ ਜਾਣਾ, says, how do I describe, how do I say, how do I state, how do I know, how do I really convince my beloved. It's the focus, the obsession is, developing that love, seeding that seed within me of love, so that every response becomes intuitive and not formulaic in nature. The Guru says, develop that love for the Shabad, so that every response is organic. It comes from your very being, your core. And you don't have to think, okay, what now? What should be the response for this? What should be the response for grief? What should be the response for death? The Guru says, turn it on its head. You don't respond, consciously. You become the response by living that experience. And that is when, grief transforms into something very beautiful, and it doesn't pain you the way, it does to everyone else. Sorry for me.
No, so beautiful, so beautiful. And I only have like one little thing to add. I think that the thing that you just said about not falling into formulaic responses points to something that's come up a ton in the chat, and I think probably is a pretty universal experience for anybody going through, like, death and grief, where other people are telling you how you ought to be responding, um, and what feels, like, appropriate or what doesn't, and the thing I said earlier about, like, every time that I've experienced death, um, I feel both well practiced at it and also like I'm learning it for the first time, and I think that's because you respond and you grieve in the form that you need in the context that you're in. And so I think the only thing that I'll add, which I think is sort of an offshoot of what both of you were talking about, is like, yes, turn to the Shabad and also like be compassionate with yourself and with everybody else who's grieving when you see the sort of different hues of how people are going through the motions of their grief. And you see different responses to how people are either interacting with the the person who has passed or not. Like I think there's often statements about what is right and what is wrong in terms of like, do you go see the person who's just passed away to do whatever you need to do or say whatever you need to say? Or do you not? And like for some people, is that really easy? And some people that's really hard? Yeah. I think that there's like a lot of judgment that we place around how people grieve, even amongst like really close family. And I'm speaking from like the experience of my nonna passing away this year of like different reactions from different, children of his of, like, how they're gonna navigate that passing, and our tendency into judgment, I think maybe because we also use that as a coping mechanism. Um, so yeah, that's the only thing I'll add is, like, it feels like the main thing is turn to the Shabad, which will do what it needs to do to transform you, even if it takes time, and be compassionate with yourself and with everyone else as you navigate that transformation. Yeah.
Simran, thank you so much. We are approaching time, but I think we have perhaps a few minutes for one last question, and then we can wrap up. So this question is from Mandeep. Um, that they often hear that our life is pre-written before we are born, and how long we live when we pass is already written. So Mandeep has just asked if you will have any comments on this concept of a pre-written destiny, a pre-written path. Maybe I'm not sure about a quick comment, but perhaps you could share your thoughts, all three of you.
Yeah, sure. You know, at a lot of places when the Guru Granth Sahib, you see that, for instance, Gurbani says, "Maran likhaye mandal mein aaye." Even before a life or anything that's tangible, uh, comes into existence, its end or its destruction or its end of life is already written and pre-decided. So yes, Gurbani does talk about, you know, it's in the sense that, everything that you see around you, so that you don't create this fancy ideas of, developing love with things and hoping that they will stay with you forever, both you and whatever the thing is, whether it's your loved ones. So I think it's a way of Guru reminding us that everything in life is temporary, more than actually starting to believe in, again, in the formulaic sense, trying to create frames and fixations that bog our minds and then holds it back from actually really realizing its true self. So instead of using these ideas as frames which box your ideas and way you think, let's use it as perspectives that the Guru is giving us, that, everything around you is temporary in nature. So instead of taking it as destiny and other things, maybe let's turn it around and see it in different light, which is, the Guru's reminder that everything in life is temporary. The only way those things become permanent is, it reminds me of a Rajasthani saying which says, there are only two kind of people who live forever. It's funny, but that's true. And we'll use it to our advantage and reinterpret it. It says, those people, ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਦੀ ਨਾ ਗੀਤ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਆ ਤੇ ਪੀਤ ਹੁੰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਗੀਤ ਹੁੰਦੇ song. People who have songs written in their name or who write songs, maybe just take it any way you want. And those who have peats. Peats are memorials, the walls, who have memorials built in their name. They are the ones who live forever. And I find this idea very powerful. I don't really believe in this peat idea because everything is, even the things that we assume are forever aren't actually forever. But I find this idea, since we did Vanjara just last year. So I'm so very fascinated and, with this idea of song. That people who have songs written in their name, or you can say who have a song in their hearts, or who have become the song itself. For me, that song is Shabad. That when I merge with the Shabad and I become the Shabad, that is when I actually in that way even transcend the destiny that we were talking about. Even that destiny doesn't matter, because destiny says it's predetermined when I'll die. And when I merge with Shabad, I even change their destiny. See how beautiful that it just came to my mind. I even changed their destiny by merging with the Shabad. And there's Mahla Tija da na ek slok hai, कहता है गुरमुख मुए जीव दे परवान है ना, मनमुख जन्म मरा है. The Gurmukhs who are wisdom oriented, who are Shabad oriented, or who are song oriented, they are accepted both in life and death. So in a way, they have transcended that destiny idea of, predetermined time of death and birth. They have transcended that. Nanak muye na akhiye Nanak, they are not called or considered death. Je gur ke Shabad sumai, who have merged with the Shabad, the eternal Shabad. Once I've clung to the Shabad or the song, which is eternal, who can really kill me? Nobody can. So there are also questions, in a way, challenges the popular ideas of predeterminations, life and death. So I think the Guru is more after transforming our perspectives so that we are in a state of constant love and get out of the sphere of, this formulaic understandings of boxed understandings of life and death.
Thank you all for your last comments on that question. And I'd like to, on behalf of Sikhi, thank all of our e-Sangat today, as well as our presenters, Surinder Singh, Justine Kaur, and Sanspir Singh. Thank you very much all for your time. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Also, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Stay updated of all upcoming webinars and events at sikri.org/events, and watch our webinars on demand at sikri.org/videos.
You were listening to Sikhcast by Sikh Research Institute, illuminating every path.